Welcome everyone to the first Q&A for V 1.0. We are starting with the Q&A with the module that I believe most people will be interested in because it ultimately determines the economics of the protocol and the utility that we as a service are providing. So yeah, this is going to be quite an informal Q&A. We've already presented the specification, the overview a few weeks ago. Louise, Andrew, Sean, do you think we should give a quick 5-minute overview of utility, or would you prefer to just dive right into Q&A?
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I'm fine with either. We can even split the difference and just kind of go over the overview section of what a utility module is and kind of what we're heading towards, if that makes sense. So just kind of starting at first principles basis, we're talking about the state machine protocol that kind of enables the Web3 provisioning and access, or like the decentralized apps accessing the decentralized infra, etc. And the utilitarian economy that kind of fuels that function, right? In V0, we have service nodes, validators, and applications. And very similar in V1, we have all those same actors, and we introduce the fisherman actor to enforce quality of service metrics and incentivize essentially quality provisioning, not just quantity provisioning of that Web3. So we're not really talking about, the consensus algorithm and how validators are able to come to an agreement, but we will touch on, or this module does touch on the validator actor as they are part of the economy, right? We will not touch on the persistence layer or the Merkle tree, and we will not touch on the peer-to-peer algorithm of how we are going to communicate a lot of the information. But everything else is pretty self-contained within the utility module. For those of you who are coming from the Cosmos ecosystem, you can think of this as the ABCI application, which is pocket specific. And with that, I think that's the only overview I wanted to touch on. If Luis or Sean want to add anything, or Jack, go ahead. If not, I think we can dive right in.
Do we have a question from Amy Kelly? Or have you accidentally come up? I think that was an accident. Okay. I think it would be good to dive into questions. I mean, everyone in the audience, you all can ask questions just by raising your hand with the stages feature, or if you're in Twitter, you can raise your hand over there, and we'll have someone on that end bring you through. And we also have the V1 research channel in the server here that you can type questions in if you prefer to type your questions rather than ask. If we're going to be slow on questions to start, perhaps we can go a little bit more deep dive into the utility module itself, just to fill the space until we get some people with questions.
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Go
ahead.
So I guess maybe we can talk a little bit more about the quality enforcement component of V1. Maybe we start off by explaining how quality is enforced in V0 and how that ultimately changes with the introduction of the fisherman. Okay, let's go into talking about quality enforcement, and then if we have any other questions from anyone, just please raise your hand. But just as a reminder, this is specifically a Q&A about the utility module in V1 as we introduced in the previous call, and we have outlined in the documentation that we published. So yeah, please keep your questions to that. So yeah, Andrew, let's talk a little bit about quality enforcement in V1, how we do quality enforcement in V0, starting with that, and then how that changes when we introduce the fisherman in V1.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you guys who have been around for, a decent while, I'm talking early days of the network, even earlier than now, we have always said that on-chain QoS is going to be our path forward to be very, very competitive with the centralized providers, if not supersede their capabilities. We had kind of thought originally that when we first baked V0 into the white paper, we thought that the quality enforcement itself would be driven by kind of this survival of the fittest in an economic sense for the highest quality node runners. And in a sense, it does. However, when the economics currently are inflationary, as everyone knows, and we are driving this growth period to bootstrap the network. During that time, though higher quality is in fact reinforced through economic incentive because you can get a higher volume of relays. And you can satisfy those when you have lower latency and better availability and better data consistency. It isn't enough to disincentivize, or we noticed early on it wasn't enough to disincentivize the worse actors, right? The ones who are just forwarding to Infura, or the ones who just have a subpar infrastructure setup. So pretty early days in the network, we realized that, okay, we need a mechanism to enforce this quality that's going to be moved on chain. In V0, which is what we're calling the current iteration since the beginning of mainnet, pre-release Pocket, is essentially enforcing quality through a second tier economic incentive and client-side validation. Client-side validation is a mechanism by which the application or the end user is able to actually challenge the data consistency, meaning the fidelity of the data they received from the service node, by essentially a majority rules digital signature comparison. What does that mean? It means that when we have 5 nodes in a session, which right now it's 24, but 5 is simpler. You can just say, okay, the end user can say, I've received 3 out of the 5 responses. It's for XYZ, and or 3 out of 5 said this, and 2 out of 5 said this. The 3 is the majority. Everyone else is incorrect, etc. And they can enforce data consistency that way, which is through a transaction that's reported by the service nodes. Okay, there's a few problems with this. Problem number 1, even though it works, is that it burdens the client to make a choice. Okay, the choice is whether or not they want to optimize for speed or they want to optimize for safety. Because even though there's not a direct incentive, in fact, there's a disincentive to provide bad data, some applications value data consistency over others, but most want both. And that trade-off, meaning having to wait for for all 5 responses to get back to you, means that you as the end user, are always waiting on the slowest response in order to satisfy that data consistency or data fidelity need, right? And what that means is that it makes it more difficult for Pocket Network to be very competitive with the centralized provider. Now let's take a look at V1 and see what the idea is there. Because at a high level, the problem with the data with the client-side validation is that you're burdening the client to do so and you're forcing them to make a trade-off. So we thought to ourselves, okay, these metrics, latency, which is in V0 is incentivized through a second order metric by volume, data consistency, which is allowed through client side validation, and availability, which of course is incentivized through the first order metric of volume. Can we purpose an actor to kind of handle and enforce all of this on chain so that the application doesn't have to make these trade-offs, right? And so that we have first order direct incentives to kind of drive this quality, and in doing so, by extension, becoming the highest quality Web3 provider, centralized or other. Okay. And that's where the fisherman comes in. Okay. This actor that we've now purposed for V1 is doing exactly that, measuring those quality metrics through incognito sampling, is what we're calling them, meaning that they're kind of similar to a mystery taster or like a food critic who comes into your restaurant and just wants to see how good your food is without knowing they're really there. They are going to be a session participant, just like service nodes and applications are, and they will act like an application would during a session by kind of taking little samples in a time-based strategy in order to see what the quality of your service is in the most high fidelity way possible in a decentralized system. And the measurements, you guessed it, that they're taking are latency, availability, and data consistency. Okay. Since I don't want to turn this into a direct lecture, I'm going to stop here and see if we have any questions or see if there's any, talking points we want to go over specifically.
I was thinking it might be insightful to expand a bit on the specific sampling methods for each of the metrics. But we can wait a moment just to see if there's any questions at this stage, and then if not, we can dive into that.
Yeah, let's just pause just a moment to see.
Yeah.
I see no hands.
Yeah, no hands.
No typing, nothing on Twitter.
No typing. Someone asked if there's a poll today. There is no poll for this call. Okay, no Twitter questions. Okay, let's proceed. So yeah, I thought it would be helpful to wait. Hang on. Yeah, so we do have a question here in chat. Someone's asking, would these metrics be collected by the fishermen? And yep, that's exactly how it would work. The fishermen are a new type of actor in the network who are their job in the same way that the validator's job is to. Oh, the question has just been edited. Let's see. So, would these metrics collected by the fishermen be available to us node runners in each session? Do you want to answer that, Andrew?
Yes. So that is correct. Yeah, the information will be available to the node runners. It's not real time. Like, you're not going to be able to see real time. I mean, one thing we thought about a lot is that, fishermen are able to do more than just what the protocol asks of it, meaning they can make dashboards, etc., but that's not really a protocol enforceable thing. But what we can force at a protocol level is reporting this information via transactions and incentivized through this utility module, which is exactly what we do. Meaning that the real time, you might be able to see your real time metrics, but you definitely will be able to see as a node runner your metrics from 2 sessions ago, etc. Right, and that will give you a really good idea because of your of how well you're performing against the rest of the network, because in fact in V1 that's the way the rewards are divided up based on your report cards, based on these metrics, right? And again, it's one of these things where the intention has always been to make this the most high quality provider that we can, but now through the fishermen we're actually able to do this on chain and have the node runners improve themselves, as well as be incentivized to improve, which today currently is a struggle and very difficult for node runners in V0. I think that answered your question. Let me know if it did not.
Yeah, and I imagine also, given that these reports are being submitted on chain, that it wouldn't be too difficult for someone like PocketScan to actually compile and summarize that data in nice sort of visuals and tables and leaderboards and all those kinds of things. So it'd be, I think it would be quite easy for people running nodes, just as they do now, just as they're able to sort of track rewards per service domain and so on, to actually be able to track quality reports per node as well.
Keyword per node, exactly. Not only can PocketScan do it, which we all love PocketScan, but you as the individual node runner, since this information is coming in the form of a transaction, any full node on the network can monitor this information, create a Grafana dashboard from it, and understand their performance and every performance of the service nodes that are on the network, right? So yes, it is going to be highly available information, as anything on chain is for the node runner. And the telemetry to expose that will be, I can only imagine, very highly popular.
Yep. So we have two more questions here. I'm going to ask the second one first because it feels more relevant to the topic. So how is the fisherman setup different from the full node? Does a fisherman need to be a full-time fisherman?
Yes, the fisherman does need to be a full-time fisherman. It is a staked on-chain actor, very similar to that of a validator or service node. They also will stake for the chain, and it is they are required through the SLA to provide a service URL, just like the validators, the service nodes, and the validators and the service nodes. So they are different than a full node. I think you could compare them most similarly to a validator. As Jack said, validators are purposed to validate blocks. So the idea here is to have a separation of these responsibilities between all of these actors instead of coupling them, so that each actor can be the most efficient for their job. In fact, our early design decisions, the V1 early development, point to us heading towards different configurations per actor specific, per having a specific configuration per actor.
And then we had a follow-up question from the same person here. Is there a fisherman for the fisherman who watches the watchman?
The watcher of the watchman is the almighty DAO. And we have this module called the Good Citizens module, which is very similar to a reporting system that is implemented by many Web 2 services, where you're able to, as any person participating or interacting in sessions, meaning applications and service nodes, are actually able to submit their information to do a back check on these fishermen and monitor the fishermen. Also keep in mind that the entry requirements to a fisherman are quite high, and they require the proof of authority and entry that's submitted through the DAO. So there is not only a high requirement to get in, but you are being watched by the network. So it's to answer your question more succinctly, the DAO and crowdsource.
Yep. And then we had another question here. Can we expand on the geozone aspects of V1 and how pocket node location will figure into the reward allocation vis-a-vis quality of service?
Absolutely. So geozones are a concept we're really excited about. It's to put it simply, geographic location is incredibly important for high fidelity latency and availability for your applications. Okay, that's just the same reason why if you create an account or create a server with DigitalOcean or AWS, you should pick a region for your application, right? Now, Pocket is already a global provider, but unfortunately, the way that the V0 sessions work today is it's a global selection, right? Meaning that we don't divide up based on geographic region. Okay. So in V1, we enable this new feature, which is called GeoZones, which acts very similar to a relay chain ID, which everyone here, if you're not familiar with, is a 4-character identifier saying which blockchain you are serving and categorizes it within a specific bucket. Now, you can imagine that the geozones act in a very similar way, where they're defined by the network and for the network, and they divide that bucket even further. So that means that the inflation created in that specific bucket is divided amongst the providers. Now, remember that just like V0, V1 creates inflation through the volume of relays served and the capacity of the applications using it. Okay. What this means is that when you're talking about reward division, you have your, if you're servicing in GeoZone A, which could, let's say, I said A, but it'd likely be like 0001. That could be considered US East. And then if you're serving for chain 0021 Ethereum mainnet, you would be in one specific bucket and have and the rewards would be contained within that session or within that collection of that bucket. And you would be cut in based on your quality of service. I think that was a comprehensive answer. If it was too much information or we need clarification on any point, just let me know.
Okay, and then we have another question here in the chat. So I guess the sort of abstracting the question a bit, we're trying to get a sense for how will a service node's test score ultimately influence selection for service. So if a node is ranked 4.9 out of 5 and another node is ranked 3.5, what is the likelihood of 3.5 node ever being selected over the 4.5 node from sessions after session?
Sorry, I was muted. So the test score is a reflection of reward and economics. Right? Currently, in the current spec of V1, it does not play into session generation and give you a higher probability of being selected as a servicer. But what it does is enable you to earn more rewards. Okay. You can think of the quality, or if you can think of the volume of the service or the volume of the relays as the inflation of the reward. You can think of the quality, meaning your test score, compared to those in your test score bucket, the distribution, right? And that gives you a really good idea. Where you think, okay, if my node is higher quality, and even if I'm not servicing at that very moment, right? If I'm within that bucket, I will get rewards proportional to my historical quality, which is my report card, right? Now, keep in mind, there are some nuances here that I'm kind of glossing over. Like there's a minimum test score threshold you must meet in order to be eligible to receive rewards. And there's also a minimum test score threshold for you, or excuse me, a report card threshold for you to receive rewards. there's a quantity of test scores that you must have to be able to receive rewards, a minimum. There is a minimum amount that you have to receive in terms of a test score where you don't get burned. And there is a FIFO queue of when that history gets cycled compared to your last expiring reward. So there's a few details there that enable it to be a more kind of high fidelity mechanism, but it's something that if you look at it from a macro point of view, you can think of the distribution based on your quality and then the inflation based on the volume. I think that answered the question. Again. If you need clarification, let me know.
If I can sort of simplify that last point about the FIFO queue, essentially what we're saying is test scores will expire. So if you have a period of really bad service out of your control and this impacts your test score, eventually those test scores will be cycled through as you're sampled more by the fishermen. I think another point to make here is apps will have will be able to configure how they send requests however they want. In theory, an app could use test score data for their own cherry picking methods. But ultimately, that's not going to impact the payment of to the service node, because service nodes are no longer paid proportional to the volume of work that they've done. They're paid according to the quality of work. So it's feasible that an app may avoid a service node because they recently had some bad scores. But that's not going to stop a fisherman from continuing to sample that service node. And that service node is going to be able to rebuild their reputation. And ultimately, the payment is determined by that reputation rather than how many sessions an app is in, or a node is in, and how many requests an app is sending to that node. Did I get anything wrong there, or was that a reasonable explanation?
Perfect.
Okie dokie. Okay, so we have a question here. Is there an opportunity here to allow apps to stake more pocket to only have sessions with higher quality nodes? Example, an app stakes X% more to only be paired with nodes in a top 25% leaderboard as determined by their report card.
Okay, so interestingly enough, the out of the box V1 comes with a feature as written currently that is very similar to that, where you are able to configure the number of nodes in your session as an app, which is different from V0 where it's a global wide metric. Anytime you cast a wider net, you're able to get the higher quality service nodes. So essentially what you're talking about, the feature you're specifying and the feature I just said is almost identical, right? Because let's say you are able to stake, 100 pocket, and 100 pocket gives you 100 relays, and through those 100 relays you configure 25 nodes per session, but you're only going to submit relays to the top 10 nodes, right? As opposed to a tiered system as you had described, where you have to stake 100 pocket and you get the top 10 nodes automatically, and then you're only able to do 10 nodes worth of relays, etc., right, in the max relay sense, right? So I believe the feature that you're requesting is satisfied by that facet of the new protocol. But if there is more to it than that, then that can definitely be considered as a candidate feature, because I know you worded it as, is there an opportunity to do something like that? I think there would be an opportunity to do something like that. I just don't know. It would have to go through the forums and would have to scrub down a little bit to see if this is really any different than what I just described.
So if we can break down a bit more what you just described. I mean, the explanation there was great, but maybe I'm being a little bit slow here. But so, are you saying that the more pocket an app stakes, they will be able to configure their session to have more nodes, or is the configuration of their session independent of how much pocket they've staked?
The configuration is independent, but the maximum allotted relays, just like it is for V0, is per node, right? So when you stake more, you're able to get more relays per node, right? So essentially saying if Pocket had a higher tier where they would be able to sync more relays for a higher premium to get, or excuse me, sync more Pocket to get a higher premium tier of nodes, but like have lower max relays is the same thing. Does that make sense, Jack? Let me know if I need it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're essentially, the more that you stake, the more relays you'll be able to concentrate on the best nodes in your session. So the more you'll be able to cherry pick, essentially.
Exactly. So it's a net. It's net equal to that feature that was described, in my view.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I would almost
I'm
argue
learning stuff here as well.
sorry, I would almost argue it's better than the feature described, because if you happen to run out of your quote unquote high tier max relays, you can always fall back to the medium to lower tier, right? So that's why, you know, I kind of see it as an overlap at the very least.
It's also better in the sense that it keeps payments to service nodes neutral, because service nodes are still getting the opportunity to be matched into sessions and ultimately sampled by fishermen. Whereas if we had a mechanism that was impacting the ability for service nodes to be sampled, then it's not going to be as neutral.
Because you're saying that the higher quality tier would be in a different bucket, correct?
Yeah, they'd be in a different bucket. They'd be matched into sessions more often, and they'd be able to get sampled more often.
Okay. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so any more questions on that topic? No one else has written in V1 research. Any questions from Twitter? If there are, just feel free to sort of unmute and speak. Oh, we have a question here in the stage. I've invited you up, Amish. I think you need to accept the invite on your end.
There we go.
Perfect.
All right, there we go. Oh, it's at the top of the screen. All the controls are at the bottom. Why would they put that way at the top of the screen? All right. So I've been reading under the quality incentives. Spent a lot of time actually reading through that recently, trying to figure out exactly what it's how it's changing. Because it talks, I mean, it's nifty. You know, the idea of a fisherman going into a session, you know, and then testing every single, you know, relay or every single node, you know, servicer, you know, within that session, and then checking each of their scores. And then they get paid, you know, according to that, or at least rather than getting 100% of the rewards they would have gotten, they get, you know, some less depending on their quality. But my question is, are the rewards then 100%? Are they only from sessions with fishermen? So the real world sessions aren't the ones that they get paid for? No, it's only the ones where they're all tested together in a session with a fisherman? Or is it, yeah, I'm not quite sure how that's, because, yeah, in the quality incentives, quality based, it almost sounds like, I wasn't sure if I was reading that it's actually only the fisherman sessions that they actually get paid for.
Yeah, so the fishermen are part of the. I mean, sorry, I'll let you, Andrew. I'll let you answer that.
Oh, it's okay, Jack. Yeah, I'll just jump in here. So you can think of the fisherman sessions as the sessions where we get to improve the quality of Pocket network, Okay. Meaning that all they're doing is feeding data into the network to ensure the people that get the distribution of the rewards are the most accurate, right? So there is a threshold where you need to be with a fisherman before you can start to receive rewards. And if you are somehow forever without a fisherman, which, you know, by design of the network shouldn't ever happen through pseudo-random selection and the law of large numbers, then you could fall out of rewards. But during that period of time where you have, you know, enough reports about your service node to be in the eligible category as described in the pseudocode, you are receiving rewards no matter if you're with the fisherman or not, right? And that's just based on your historical performance. So in a way, it's capitalistic because it's based on how well you do, but in another way, it's socialized a little bit because it's not real time, right here, right now. I'm not with a fisherman, so I don't get paid. It's like, I was with a fisherman 2 sessions ago. Here's what he said about me, or here's my total aggregate report card. And based on the inflation during that session, I get this distribution towards me, and whatever percentage is burned based on how well or not, or how poorly I did. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
It's also important to note that the fisherman is incognito because they're borrowing the AAT from an application, and it's random. So, as far as the service node is concerned, they don't know whether they're doing relays for a normal app or a fisherman.
And just to clarify one, the inflation itself, a fisherman does not have to be involved in the session whatsoever. The actual coins that go into the bucket are real volume metrics, whether there's a fisherman watching or not. If that clarified, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So the volume of inflation is every session determines the volume of inflation. It's the distribution of that inflation that's determined by the reputation that the fisherman is measuring.
So it says here also in the same area, it says, is the total salary for the services still proportional to the volume of relays performed on aggregate? Okay. I'm trying to figure out exactly what you guys are meaning by aggregate here. Does that mean that you are still paid for your, is it saying that individually your service node, handles this many relays in this session, and then you had because you did this many relays, you would therefore earn this many rewards, and then it takes your 0 to 100% score, and then it reduces your rewards based on the difference between under 100% that you got on your score. Is that what it's saying? So it's still by volume, but it's reduced based on your quality. Or is it saying that it's divided among the entire group then based on quality?
The amount to be distributed is the total amount that was done in that session, whether you did it or not.
Mm-hmm.
The way that it is distributed is amongst people based on their scorecards.
Okay. And when it says burned, does it mean the coin is actually burned, or does it mean redistributed to the ones who had better scores?
So I think it's technically never produced, right?
Yeah, never produced. It's just a simple way of, sorry about that wording. It's just a way of saying that essentially, the math is a lot easier if you think of this as the total volume that was done, and this creates this many coins. And then everyone has an equal opportunity to get this bucket of coins based on just participating. And then now, based on your quality score, you're going to receive less than that if you're less than 100%, right?
Right. That makes sense. And the concept of the fisherman going into a session and testing everybody against each other for availability, latency, and consistency, that's beautiful. That makes perfect sense in my mind. That's a neat feature. But that's all I had to say for the moment.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a question here. It's maybe not a question for the panel, but someone's requesting if we can have some more diagrams explaining the reward system and the economics and so on. And I think that's something that we can work on. We'll, as we're fleshing out these specifications, as we're working on things, and so on. I think that's definitely something I would like to see as well, for sure. Okay.
Yeah, totally agree. Mm-hmm.
Oh, we've got another question here. Hey, Shane.
Hey, thanks. So with Fisherman kind of taking over quality of service on the on-chain side, and then with the idea of geolocations also adding quality of service as well, and that's all happening on-chain. I do have a question for like kind of one of the remaining aspects of that centralized services can offer, where if you go over your amount that you're essentially paying for, most of the services don't do any kind of like hard stop. So if, like, say your app goes viral and it goes past what your stake is, you don't get cut off of service, and typically they'll ping you and let you know, hey, you're over your amount, let's upgrade you or something like that, but there's not like a cutoff. I know that I've talked to different team members and whatnot about this before, and I was wondering, if there was any thoughts on an on-chain mechanism that would offer that kind of quality of service as well, where you don't have any hard cutoffs, at least without warning, if, say, your app goes viral or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually on the I think it's our number one candidate feature. It's been highly considered and is still being considered, so I can't say anything officially. But the way we're thinking about that specific issue is that retroactively we can say, instead of being a hard cutoff, we can allow the service nodes to just, and this is a little bit freeing from their standpoint as well, not have to monitor max relays and just go up to a certain allowance based on the max relay staked. Because since all of the data, the volume data, and the quality data is going on chain, we can retroactively take action based on behavioral patterns, right? So let's say, for instance, your max relays is 1,000 relays per node. And let's say the allowance by default in core, which will be enabled through the config file, is 10x that. Okay, so that means each node can do 10,000 relays, or will allow the 10,000. But then when it comes to the volume reporting, which is verified through the digital signatures, the service or the application obviously went over their allotted relays if they get close to 10,000. That's when action can be taken. There's going to be significant delay. The action itself is right now nondescript, but we were imagining a mechanism that would enable kind of this ledger of behaviors and malicious behaviors, if you will, if you want to call it malicious, where they have gone over their max relay. And if it's not corrected based on that state information over some period of time, that's when economic disincentives start happening, like burning, etc. That way it kind of mocks that centralized feature that you're kind of talking about, by retroactively enforcing max relays as opposed to real-time enforcement, which originally we saw security bump, but I think a few others have echoed your concern, where that's, even though it might be a security bump from the application or from the service node standpoint, it actually defeats a lot of the user experience in that realm that you would get from a centralized provider. And like I said at the beginning of this call, our North Star is to be competitive and supersede the centralized provider in all capabilities. So, short answer is it's on the top of our hit list. We are in discussions about it. And this kind of wraps into the previous question about we're very early days on this, guys. This is the earliest in the history of Pocket Network we put anything out there. And, you know, we have the specifications, we're beginning development, but a lot of things are going to evolve in that time with the help of the community. This is one of those things we're still working on, and we think we have a good solution for it. But at this time, I can still only call it a candidate feature, but it is something we're actively thinking on. And if it's not out of the box for V1, excuse me, it can go through the forums and definitely gain some traction and support from the community to push it forward. I hope that answered your question, Shane.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Great to hear kind of where the team's pulse is on that. So thanks.
Thanks, Shane. So I was thinking we are starting to get to the end of the allotted hour. I was thinking that we could maybe touch on some of the scalability topics as well, because we've talked a lot about quality enforcement and rewards and so on. But I think it's worth giving some time to our move towards optimistic proofs of samples as opposed to pessimistic proofs of relays. Do you want to give a quick overview of that, Andrew, and then we can see if we have any questions on that subject?
Yeah, absolutely. So the word pessimistic is from a computer science standpoint, and it's not really saying, oh, we're pessimistic. It's just saying that, look, right now in our system, you need to prove through a zero knowledge range proof that you did every single relay, as opposed to an optimistic system in V1 where you can just say, you know, I did these relays, and then sometimes you have to prove it. And when you have to prove it, that is when you would get burned proportional to the optimism, right? If you were unable to prove it, right? The reason why an optimistic system is generally considered more scalable than a pessimistic one is because you have less overall data and compute. Because instead of every single time you guys do relays, and I say you guys, node runners, do relays in their sessions, you have to create a Merkle tree per bucket, right? Which currently is chain ID, application, and relay chain ID and application and session block height. And that enables you to, that requires you to do a high compute operation to create a succinct proof that shows that you did these relays of the form of two transactions, which is a claim and a proof. Now in V1, there's this concept of not having to do that all at once, meaning that for fishermen, they are actually able to say, you know, hey, these are my reports, and only a fraction of the time, let me take a step back, only a fraction of the time the fishermen are actually in the, right? The fishermen aren't in every session, or at least out of the box, it's configurable. If they are in every session, they can be dialed down, right? This enables automatically less transactions. Now, even more so, if you think of an analogy of these fishermen test scores are like claims in today's system, the proof transaction, which is the heavier one in V0, not necessarily in V1, but it is a second transaction, is required even less times, which is that pie diagram that you see in the specification. Now, what this enables is a logarithmic decrease of the number of transactions in the network overall, right? Simply because you don't have to have this ideology that everything must be proven. It's some things must be proven, okay? We're going to take your word for it on most things, but some things must be proven. And if you get it wrong, it's a heavy fine. It's kind of like if you're speeding on the highway, you're not going to get caught every time, but when you do get caught, it's a hefty fine, right? This idea of optimistic submission is also coupled with the constant sampling strategy of a time-based sampling strategy, which does not scale linearly with the number of relays. Let me explain. Fishermen are currently, as designed, sampling, as a mock example, once per minute. Okay, I mean, they take one sample per minute, and they are actually going to be bounded to that session based on the time, which means if you're taking 1 minute samples and you have 60 minutes in a session, just for example, that means you have 60 samples constantly, right? No matter if there's millions of relays or hundreds of. What this enables is that you'd have less storage requirements overall as a fisherman. Now let's bring it back to the service nodes, who we haven't even talked about. The service nodes are not even required to store relays anymore because the fishermen are the ones submitting the quote unquote claim and proof transactions. The service nodes are only required to store special relays where you have these hash collisions that, for example, for a Bitcoin example, result in a four zeros at the end of the hash, right? Which can symbolize a probabilistic volume metric, right? Let's say based on how the nonce is tweaked, if you do 1,000 relays, you will get a zero, a trailing zero, probabilistically 1 out of 1,000 times, right? That's the idea, and that means that one relay can actually prove 1,000 relays completed. Now, all of these things together, where you have the service nodes storing less, or like not all the relays, but just a fraction of the relays configured by the nonce. You have the fishermen who are not in every session, but only proving it even a more fraction of the time. When you combine all these things together, you have less transactions, you have less storage requirements, less compute requirements overall, which we see today in V0 with these quite high resource requirements for node runners, because the node runners today have to do all of that. They have to store the relays, they have to compute the Merkle tree, they have to submit 2 transactions while doing the service. Okay, and that in itself, and before we had the separation of validators and services, they were also doing block validation. So that in itself is a good illustration point of scalability improvements between V0 and V1 as we head towards a more quote unquote optimistic worldview from a protocol standpoint.
That was an awesome overview, Andrew. Thanks for that. Oh, interesting. So someone just asked, does that mean that in V1, if a service node gets rebooted before showing proof of their work, they don't actually lose the rewards since the fishermen are taking care of that?
That is correct. They would not lose their rewards. They would, the only thing they might have, and this is a big might, we're talking about implementation. The only thing they could potentially lose if there was a persistence issue is that volume metric, which is more of a global inflation thing than it is, a direct reward. So yes, their report cards certainly would not be affected. If you were rebooting at the very moment where a fisherman sampled you, you would have a null sample, and that availability metric would reflect on your report card. But other than that, yes, you're completely correct.
Yeah, so you're not going to lose proof that you did the work, but you might lose proof of how many relays were done, which ultimately determines the total inflation. And you might be sampled poorly by the fishermen. Do we have any other questions about that topic specifically? Hey, Shane.
Yeah, hey, just one question. With the report cards, are they per chain? So like a service node can have a bad report card per this relay chain ID. So say they have a Avalanche node that isn't working properly. Do they get penalized on, like, say, the Ethereum side?
Yes, report cards are per bucket. And the only mutually exclusive, to my knowledge, off the top of my head, the only mutually exclusive feature that are not that you can't maintain 2 at once are geozones, right? The relay chain IDs, you can maintain multiple report cards for your identity. but the geozone is linked to, you can only have one geozone at a time, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So there is a total inflation. This idea that total inflation is determined by volume, that's true, but that total inflation is divided into relay chains and geozones, and then within those relay chains and geozones is divided according to the report card specific to those. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, and then Amish, I've just invited you up. Remember, it's at the top of the screen.
There we go. Took a long time to show up. So, yeah, my question is how personal the fishermen are, because earlier, as I was reading, it sounds more like it's, more or less random by geographic location. The fisherman goes into a session with a, group of, servicers, and then tests each of them against each other, and gives them their scores. But then what you just said now was, yeah, but a service or a fisherman might show up to test you. Is it? That sounds individual, not, the kind of impersonal. Hey, pseudo random going to a bunch of different sessions here and there in geographic locations, testing everybody against each other. What? Yeah, I'm just not quite sure what the difference is. Do they target individual nodes? Is that a thing? Or do they somehow control who goes into a session so that they can check that specific node? Or
No. Your first explanation was correct. I apologize if my language made it seem personal, but no, absolutely, it's the pseudo random selection. They don't, even the fishermen don't get to decide who gets in a session. They just happen into the session. Yeah.
Okay. That worried me.
Yeah, you're correct.
Okay. Yeah, because you'd said if you rebooted, then you might have a fisherman come to visit you, afterwards, so that you can. That sounded very personal.
What I meant to say is, if you happen to be in a session with a fisherman and you reboot at the very time that could be reflected on the report. That's a good catch. I didn't mean to imply they could seek anyone. No, that's not it.
Good. Thank you.
We have another question here in the chat. I think there's three parts to this. There's a few parts to this. So the first is, do we have an idea of how many fishermen are required compared to the number of service nodes? And then the other part of that is, since it sounds like the threshold to be a fisherman is quite high, what is the incentive to be a fisherman?
Yeah, so the first one's difficult to answer at this time. I think any answer I give you right now, the specific ratio of fishermen to service nodes is likely going to be off. But as I mentioned earlier, fishermen samples are constantly bounded per session, which means that the fishermen can scale quite well compared to the number of services. I think that's as comfortable as I am right now of what I can say there. Unfortunately, I know that's a cloudy and hazy, so I apologize. But yeah, the idea is that the fishermen will have a one-to-many relationship to the service nodes, and it will not be there will not be, the ratio will be determined, I suppose, and right now I can't speak to that. The second part, Jack, can you reiterate that one more time for me?
Yeah, so the second part alluded to the fact that the requirement to be a fisherman is quite high. It's not going to be as accessible as being a service node. And therefore, with that in mind, what is the incentive to actually be a fisherman?
Right. So the fisherman incentives are similar to that of the service nodes, where they are generated from the inflation of the network, meaning that, you know, they come from that same bucket, if you will, of the utility, as most, if not all, rewards do. Right? I think it actually is all, if you can think about it from a macro level. But the actual mechanism of distribution of those rewards for the fishermen are based on the number of non-null samples collected, regardless of the content of the sample. It does. What I mean by that is whether or not it's a good sample or a bad sample, whether or not you're saying this service node did the X or Y or Z, as long as your sample is non-null, meaning that you have an incentive to take the samples and you have an incentive to make sure that they're not null, and the service node is available, then you are able to get rewards proportional to the samples taken. So it's kind of similar to a volume distribution as V0 is, but for fishermen. The one thing I will say on that is that it is a high bar for fishermen, and the economics of which are continuing to be modeled out. But it's not one of those things where I have a strict, here's how much they're going to make or anything. But I can explain that the mechanism itself of the sampling strategy is that of the non-null samples collected at any one point in time. And just like service nodes today, it's a pseudo-random flip of the coin of what session you're going to be in and how many non-null samples.
Thanks for that. Do we have any more questions in the chat or Twitter or here in the call?
We might be a little over time anyway, Jack.
Yeah, we are. So yeah, I think we can wrap up here. Just before we do, I would like to just remind everyone that in the original introductory call, we touched on this idea that V1 for us is not just about re-architecting the stack and unlocking the future of Pocket Network. It's also about doing that for the community and the development cycle. We're quite serious about making sure that we're working towards an R&D cycle for V1 that tightly incorporates community feedback, community ideas, and all is part of our journey on becoming an amazing DAO. So I invite all of you, anyone interested in these topics, to read through the documentation that we published. So in the main doc site, we have some explainers of V1. These are essentially overviews of all of the features that we've been talking about. And then at the bottom of these, we have a link to the deeper software specifications that the protocol team have put together. And after reading these, and as you read through these, if you have any questions, if you have any feature requests, any ideas, then please feel free to share and start a discussion. We have the V1 research channel in Discord, and we have a research category in the forum as well. So if you have any thoughts about V1, feel free to share. Okay, we have another question here. I'll bring you up to the stage.
I don't know if you touched on it yet, but will there be any doxing of the team?
Sorry?
Will there be any doxing of the team? Like, will they put LinkedIn or something?
The team is already doxed. We're all, you can see the names of people here on the panel. You can see most of the team on LinkedIn. That wasn't a V1 question, but thanks for that anyway. Okay. But yeah, with with that note, I'll just remember what I said about sharing any thoughts that you have and participating in the discussion. We're all really excited to see what the community thinks about some of these ideas and to start working towards launching V1 together. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank everyone.
Thank you.
Cheerio. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.